Today, we're going to reach halfway around the world to New Zealand. We're going to speaking to a gentleman. He's a CPA and a PhD, a gentleman who has delved deeply into this drug war, who understands its futility, and I guess expresses his frustration, if you will, on his WordPress site. And today we're going to talk about what I think is his most recent. It's titled up, "What We've Been Told About Drugs Isn't True." And there's not a more profound thought in the world than that. I often talk about those who believe in drug war and just believe in it. They don't need any evidence. It's what's been handed down from granddaddy to daddy to them. And it's a quasi-religion, and they just think it's heresy to talk about changing the drug war. And with that, I want to welcome Mr. Julian Buchanan. Thanks for being with us again, Julian.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me back again. Much appreciated.
Yes, sir. Now, here in the U.S., I'm much frustrated with drug reform, if you will. We've been at it for more than 20 years, and we're still making incremental progress. It took 100 years to fall into this pit, and I just don't want it to take 100 years to climb out of it. Your response to that thought, Julian?
Yeah, and I think what we've got to do is not be afraid of the debate. We are dealing with, as you rightly said earlier, an ideology, and we are dealing with almost like a belief system, and people have been indoctrinated, and people have see this drug war as part of the truth, and it isn't the truth. It's built on propaganda. It's built on misinformation. It's built on prejudice, and it's rooted in power and vested interest. And we will be at it for another 100 years, I think, unless we expose it for what it is. And my concern is that a lot of our approaches do not address the fundamental issues. As reformers, we mustn't be frightened. We mustn't be asking for crumbs under the table. We mustn't collude with the misinformation, or some reformers adopt the prohibitionist language. And I think we've got to help the mass and the public understand that this is a deeply flawed and damaging system. And so I'm not interested, to be honest, in incremental reform. I understand that the process of abolition might take a while, and there might be incremental stages towards that. But I'm not interested in pleading with prohibitionists to invite cannabis to join alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, and caffeine at the privileged table, because all we're doing is perpetuating and reaffirming a system that needs to be exposed because it's got no scientific basis to it.
So true. Thank you for that. I applaud your words. I do, sir, because, I mean, here in the U.S., I think maybe a majority of people understand the drug war's failure, and a majority of the drug reform, huge majority of drug reform in the United States revolves around cannabis. And too often I hear these cannabis users dismissing people who use heroin or coke or whatever, as if they were cops themselves, as if they wanted to pin on a badge and arrest their allies, their friends that they probably did drugs with a few times. And now they want to demonize the other because they can, I guess. And it boils down from my perspective to this, Julian, by that I mean the knowledgeable folks. I think there's very few people in the U.S. Who truly get this, who want real legalization because they've examined this to its heart, to its base, and they understand there's no benefit whatsoever. The drug war has no benefit, does it, sir?
I agree with you that the number of people who fully understand it is limited, and it is a problem when people get invited to the top table and then they start behaving, as you say, like prohibitionists towards the people who use the other drugs, and the whole system is flawed. And you say there is no benefit, but unfortunately, I think there is a lot of benefit in prohibition. And this is part of the problem, is that prohibition, on my website, I've identified 20 groups who benefit from prohibition. So clearly, prohibition is benefiting politicians because they can be they can talk about the fear of the war on drugs. They can talk about getting tough on drugs, and that wins votes. It benefits the police department because they can confiscate and they can get assets through the police through confiscations of drugs and the assets that are associated with drugs. The police can also pull down more and more resources from government towards waging war on drugs, and it makes arrests very easy too, because it's so easy to plant, a small bag of cocaine or whatever on somebody. So there's loads and loads of benefits, and of course it benefits the drugs that are privileged, the alcohol industry, the caffeine, the tobacco, and the pharmaceutical industry would all be hit if all drugs were legally regulated and available. And I would say that what we need to do is every person needs the right to possess, to produce, and to cultivate any drug that they want for personal use. And if that was the case, then there'd be loads of people who would be trying other substances because they can't afford the big pharmaceutical purchase of say cannabis or whatever, or opioids, and people would be, but it would also free up, because when we talk about the war on drugs, it's not, we know it's a war on drug users, not a war on drugs, but it's not just a war on drug users, because it's not everybody who uses drugs who gets arrested. Law enforcement doesn't tend to target people who look like you and I. Law enforcement will target and put heavily resource enforcement and policing in areas where people of colour, where ethnic groups and the poor are. So if we will know that most of our government officials have used drugs, but they were not at risk of being targeted, arrested. And if they ever did end up in the process, they've got all sorts of escape routes to prevent them from ever getting there. So if we were able to legalize all possession, cultivation, and production for personal use, it would remove the police's harassment of people of colour and poor communities for simply using drugs. So there are lots of vested interests that keep this war on drugs perpetuated. We sit here saying that it's a failure. It's nonsense. It does no good, but it does do good to a whole pile of people. So we have to acknowledge, if we're to tackle and end this drug war, we've got to acknowledge who's benefiting from it, really.
Yeah, no, and I should phrase my question or my phrase better, because there is no benefit for you or me or our kids or future generations. It's all for the fat cats, for the banks that launder the money, for the cartels that smuggle the stuff, for the gangs that sell it on the street corners, for the cops, as you say. There's a lot of fat cats who benefit, but nothing for the average Joe to hang his hat on. There's nothing.
No. And it is something that is really beneficial for them, but it doesn't do what it purports to do. That's the issue. I mean, Joe Public imagines that the drug war is about reducing supply, reducing demand, and keeping people safe. Now, if we go to that agenda, then the drug war is a total failure. But really, it's never been about that. And if it was about that evidence base, it's a total failure. And how could it be sustained for 50 years or 60 years? And it doesn't stack up against the supposed aims of the drug war. So, that the highest security prison in the world can't keep drugs out of the prison. So what chance is there of seriously imagining we can keep people from using drugs in the community?
Well, there are none. Now, as I indicated as we opened the show, we're going to talk about your latest WordPress, What We've Been Told About Drugs Isn't True. And it's got 75 different fallacies that underpin drug policy. And I'm going to just start here at the top one. There's a clear pharmacological definition for drugs. And, well, they're just, what your thought? What is the...
Yeah, sure. Yeah. These 75 myths are important because you talked at the beginning about it's like an ideology. It's like a church almost that they believe and hold the faith, and whatever is said to criticize the drug war, they will defend it. And what I've tried to do in these 75 myths is to identify some of the underpinning principles that hold up this faith that they've got. And one of that first one I've mentioned, that there is what we call drugs. And again, reformers do the same thing. They say things like people aren't ready to use drugs or to accept drugs. And what they're doing is they're perpetuating this notion of drugs being those substances which are banned and listed in the UNODC. Now, those substances which are listed in the UNODC or listed by governments as being illegal to possess, they're psychoactive substances. But equally, there are a whole pile of psychoactive substances that people are using, rum, gin, Ritalin, Adderall, Valium, Ativan, cigarettes, tea, coffee, all these things, Red Bull, all these things are psychoactive. These are psychoactive, drugs. And so we need to start talking about drugs as being that we all use drugs and that drugs are around everywhere. We need to stop talking about drugs as if they are the substances that are banned. Because that perpetuates this misunderstanding that drugs are dangerous, or we need, even the notion of a drug-free world is nonsense, because the people who are calling for a drug-free world are sitting there drinking their coffee or having a break and chatting about it over a beer or whatever, and then they might be taking some Valium or whatever to help them calm down or deal or sleep or whatever. And psychoactive drugs are important for our existence, but it's this dichotomy which we've got to break. So what they refer to psychoactive drugs, there's no evidence or science behind it, and so when we talk about drugs, we've got to make sure that we are not colluding with the prohibitionist misinformation that when we talk about drugs, it only means those substances banned by government.
Yes, sir. Now, the second one here, you myth number 2, people who use drugs are suffering from a substance use disorder. And I want to throw my thought in there first that 99.9 maybe percent of all drug use is non-problematic. There are people out there, they aren't suffering, they don't need help, they don't need arrested, they're just using drugs for their own purpose. And go ahead, respond if you will, sir.
Yeah. Well, the prohibitionist notion is to conflate drug use with problematic drug use, and they are very different things. As you say, only a very small proportion of people, and some people say it's as high as 10%, but there isn't a definitive figure. But whatever figure we come to, the vast majority of people are using drugs sensibly, safely, and recreationally. And again, we just need to look at people who grab a coffee every morning. They're using caffeine, without having problems, most people. Yeah. So it's got to be seen in the same framework as having a coffee, having a beer, having a glass of wine, enjoying a cigar, or taking Adderall or whatever it is, So you're quite right. Is that and people who use drugs, they don't need help, they don't need sympathy. You don't need sympathy because I just saw you drink a cup of coffee. I'm not thinking that I've got to have a word with Dean and think about, where he can get help because I saw him drinking coffee. But that's the sort of assumptions we have with illicit drugs. Anybody who takes an illicit drug, we think they need help, they need support, they need treatment. And as you say, only a very small proportion of people actually need help. And just to further explore that, I would say that of those people who need help, only a small proportion of that proportion need professional help.
Right.
So the people that we see going round and round, what I would call the chronic, the people who are struggling with chronic addiction or chronic substance use disorder, those people are they will be the 1%. And most of those people are almost, in one sense, self-medicating for long-standing unresolved issues. So for them, chronic substance use disorder is a solution. It's not the real problem. The real problem is probably something deeper within them that they can't resolve.
Childhood abuse, all kinds,
Yeah.
PTSD,
Yeah.
You just don't know. There's a list
Exactly.
of them.
Exactly.
Next up here, and with no way in hell we're going to get through all of these today.
You pick out whichever ones you fancy. That's all right. Yeah.
I like this one. It's myth number 3. Drug users are dirty, immoral, and dangerous losers. And the fact of the matter is that is the myth. That is what perpetuates this. That is what gives it substance and teeth, that, oh my God, we got to save them. We got to protect them from themselves, even if we have to kill them. And that's where we are in this drug war. Am I right?
Yeah. No, you're right. It's crazy. It's and again, look, what we're dealing with is an institutional form of discrimination, and we have institutional discrimination. When I say institutional, I mean it's embedded within the laws and the policies of governments. It's embedded in the culture of the society, and it operates on an individual basis. So this form of institutionalized discrimination operates structurally, culturally, and individually. And we've had this before. We've had it, women have faced this. There have been laws and rules and policies that oppressed women. People with disabilities have had this. Gay people have had this. And so we've dealt with a lot of that. And by dealing with it, we've managed to remove the structural oppression that operates at a government level. So no longer are there policies. And if there are, and there was one until a few years back around the use of crack cocaine and powder cocaine, which structurally was geared in the US to make it more oppressive towards Black people. But that's like an example of the way in which we have to keep obliterating institutional and structural discrimination. But we've done it institutionally for women and for gay people, for disability and for mental health. Those issues still permeate in culture and on an individual level, because once government has peddled it for decades, it takes many, many more decades to get it out the system on a cultural basis and on an individual basis. But when it comes to drugs, we are still 50, 60 years behind, and the discrimination is at the top level. It's coming from government laws and policies, and from police, and from education, and from housing, and so we've got a massive job to do. But that's the challenge, is to look. We've exposed the hypocrisy and the oppression in relation to homosexuality. We've exposed it in relation to sexism. We've exposed it in relation to mental health and disability. And when you expose it, eventually people see the prejudice, and they eventually realize this is out of order. And we need to do the same in relation to drugs, because we all use drugs. And so this idea that drug users are dirty, immoral, or whatever, or it's just sheer propaganda, peddling prejudice and misinformation. The people who are saying it are drug users themselves.
Yeah, hypocrites all. I hear you. Once again, folks, we're speaking with Dr. Julian Buchanan out of New Zealand. Sir, I want to go to taking drugs damages people, but I want to first just kind of preface it with, I've been doing drugs for 65 years. I've had a relatively, for an uneducated guy, I did quite well in quality control, and I got into audit and project analysis and so forth. It didn't deny me potential. I stood up and to the challenge of making a living and did relatively well. And I guess my point is, it was 100 years ago in the United States. Some people like Harry J. Anslinger proclaimed themselves to be experts. They proclaimed themselves to be in charge of drugs, that they were to be listened to, and that what they said was necessary and moral and the right thing to do for America. And he, in fact, sold that idea to the world through the United Nations. And I've been asking people, drug reformers and the members of the Global Commission on Drugs and others, to stand tall, to say it is BS. There is no legitimacy to this, that we own the moral high ground. We want to stop funding terrorists and cartels and stop overdose deaths and children's easy access. We own the moral high ground. We need to stand tall. Your thought there, Julian?
No. I think if there's a message in this entire interview, I would say it's what you've just said, which is we need to stand tall and we have the moral high ground. And we need to expose all this stuff. People, everybody does drugs, so drugs don't damage people because people are doing drugs all the time, legal and illegal. Drugs can damage people. Everything can damage people. Saturated fat can damage people. Peanuts can kill people. There's all sorts of things. Everything can have risks associated with them. But I would say that 95% of the damage that we see, that we think that the public think is associated with illicit drug use, is not due to the drugs. It's due to drug prohibition.
Yes, it is. Now, Julian, I want to jump to myth number 7. Drug use fuels crime. And I went to Switzerland and I got to meet the guy who designed their heroin injection program, got to go to one of their injection facilities and learned that they have had over 20 million injections of pure heroin with 0 overdose deaths, that the people who take this heroin, they go to work, they go to school, maybe they tend their kids, but they're not out shoplifting and whoring and doing crime because they don't have to, because they don't have to pay those black market prices. Your response to that, sir?
Well, the Switzerland regime was partly based on a regime that I was involved in the 1980s. In the 1980s, I worked with Dr. John Marks in Merseyside, and I was a probation officer at the time, so I was involved and concerned about crime. And as a probation officer in the mid-late 80s, I worked closely with Dr. John Marks, and we set up the Bootle Clinic and the Waterloo Clinic, and we gave people pure opioids, methadone and heroin in injectable form. They didn't actually have to inject it on the premises, which is what they do in Switzerland. But we saw, I saw lives changed. I saw people who were running around like headless chickens, trying to commit crime, usually shoplifting, in order to then sell those goods and that in itself is a skill, trying to get the goods, trying to sell them. And then they had to go and try and find somewhere to score, which is to purchase the drugs. And in those days, in the 1980s, there were no mobile phones in those days, or if people would end up, they'd have to call and visit the places, and you'd see people climbing tower blocks to go and score and whatever. And they never quite knew what their drug was. They didn't know what was in it. They didn't know the strength of it. And if they were injecting it, they could risk all sorts of diseases of septicemia or dirt or junk. And they could have overdose because it's far too strong, or they could turkey badly. And, I had pregnant women coming to see me, and they would end up, if they end up turkeying because the gear that they bought was rubbish, then the baby ends up turkeying as well, and then they end up running the risk of a miscarriage. So we got people in, and all that activity and uncertainty and exhaustion and focus of every single day, 24/7, 7 days a week, disappeared. Because here you are, here's a clean ampule of methadone or clean ampule of heroin. Or for some people, they were on methadone linctus or whatever. And then they had a regular clean supply. And no longer did they have to worry about whether they can score, whether they can commit, whether they can get enough money, whether they can get away and not get caught with the crime. And their lives can get stability to them. So I've been there, done that, and I've seen it make sense. And I went round the UK arguing with probation, or not arguing really, but explaining to people that we need to adopt risk reduction and we need to adopt heroin and methadone maintenance because it reduces crime and it makes a difference to people's lives. When people have got that level of stability, then they can start dealing with the things that are a problem to them.
Sure.
Because it's not, drugs are not the problem. In the late 1980s in Merseyside, it was Thatcherism and mass unemployment and a serious reduction in welfare benefits.
Well, and then you speak of what, at least here in the United States, is a major factor that gets involved. You get busted, suddenly you can't get a job, you can't get credit, you can't get housing, you can't get respect anymore. The world says, oh my God, he's a druggie, we've got to ostracize and send him away. And that's part of, well, we don't have time to talk about that. I want to close this up with the thought here, sir, that I want a debate. I want the DEA or the ONDCP or the FDA to send a representative to this show. I want them to explain to me, to clarify why this is so necessary. And they run like rabbits. They cannot defend this. Do you have the same situation in New Zealand, sir?
Yeah, it's the same situation worldwide. I think it is that there'll be different degrees, of rejection of reform, but essentially there is no evidence base, there is no rational perspective that can justify the war on drugs. It's hypocritical. There isn't any science to it. It's based on racism. It's based on social control. It's based on vested interest. As you said earlier, we have the moral high ground, and that's why we need to stand tall and we need to start exposing the entire system. And I don't think we need to expose it at UNCND. I don't think we need to expose it with the government. I think we need to expose it with the public. I think parents who've got children who are being arrested, they need to understand the issues. Parents who've lost people with overdose, they need to understand the issues. The more the groundswell can come from the grassroots, because that's how we change the law for homosexuality. That's how we tackle racism. You don't tackle it by working parties of privileged people who aren't affected. And who are full of propaganda, and you don't sit around the table with misogynists trying to get them to realize that sexism is wrong or has no basis to it, because what you want is, if there's a massive groundswell through the public, through social media, and hopefully eventually through the mainstream media, then the politicians will be running scared, because anybody who responds to this mass movement towards reform will be a vote winner, because they know the public are behind them. So we get lost down the rabbit holes and of going through forever more inquiries, reviews, commissions, UNCNDs, UNGAS meetings, and every time they roll round, all the reformers, they're all delighted to be invited to speak, and they go across to Vienna. But I think it's a charade. I don't think there's never any movement in those things. And we see the same in racism. Every time there's a black person gets killed and whatever, or murdered, And then we hear there's going to be an inquiry, whatever. The black population know what the outcome's going to be, you know, and we're the same on drugs. You know what the outcome's going to be.
Yeah. Well, once again, friends, we've been speaking with Dr. Julian Buchanan out of New Zealand. Sir, hell, we made it through 4 or 5 of your 75. We're going to have to do this again and quite often. I really enjoyed our discussion. His website where you can learn more of this is Julian Buchanan, one long word, .wordpress.com. Thank you, Julian.
Thanks so much, Dean. Thanks for the time.
I'm Dean Becker. I want to thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it motivating. Now, please like and share and subscribe if you want more content. Now, to hear a longer interview with this week's video guest, I request that you visit our website. Links are in the description below. Now, each year, we produce hundreds of drug war-related programs for a network of broadcast affiliates in the U.S. and Canada. Now, we also produce lots of content for YouTube as well. And you can access nearly 9,000 of our programs at drugtruth.net.